Hello, and welcome back to Microsoft Research's lecture series in race and technology. We're bringing together leading scholars at the intersection of race studies and technology studies to address a wide range of topics. Hopefully, these lectures have been exposing you to new ideas and some new understandings of how race and tech construct each other and with what consequences. If you've missed previous lectures, they're all available to you on YouTube. Today, we are lucky to get to hear from Dr. Christina Harrington. Dr. Harrington is an assistant professor in the HCI Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, where she is also the director of the Equity and Health Innovations Design Research Lab. She's a designer and a qualitative researcher who works at the intersection of interaction design and health and racial equity, combining her background in electrical engineering and industrial design to focus on universal, accessible, and inclusive design, especially when designing products to support historically marginalized groups such as Black communities, older adults, and individuals with differing abilities. Today, she's presenting a talk called Freedom Dreams, Imagining Inclusive Technology Futures Through Co-Design with Black Americans. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harrington.
Thank you all so much for this opportunity to come and speak with you today. I want to thank the Microsoft research team, as well as everyone involved in the Race and Technology series, Brittany Mueller for organizing this, and Danae Ford Robinson for recommending me. My name is Christina Harrington. I am an assistant professor in the HCI Institute, as well as the director of Equity and Health Innovations Design Research Lab at Carnegie Mellon University. And I'm going to be talking about freedom dreams and approaches to imagining inclusive technology futures through co-design with Black Americans. So before I delve into some of the research stuff, I want to share some words from Latinx feminist and anti-racist organizer Francisca Porches Coronado, that when we look for those who are the most impacted by this moment and they'll know what to do, if you show up and follow their leadership, you will most likely feel nourished and know what to do next. So this theme of collective participation to imagine and reimagine what could be possible in our world has been one that has guided my work, both in the research that I do and in the ways that I engage with my community for as long as I can remember. So, to share just a little bit about myself, I am a design researcher who, for the past 10 plus years, has been obsessed with studying how we create things, what attracts us to the things that we use in our everyday lives, and how certain groups contribute to the ways that we think about innovation and the impact that this has on our collective future. I chose to study design because for me, it merged areas of science, creativity, and psychology of understanding people and talking to people and getting behind the why of our interactions with the world around us. What I don't think I ever realized as a part of my work in this field was that my love for science fiction novels, particularly those that were written by Black Afrofuturist writers, would one day kind of find its way into the work that I do. Interestingly, when I came into the world of design, I was more interested in design for people with varying and differing abilities, looking at people living with disabilities and impairments, older adults, but never really considering how other aspects of identity might come into play. Um, I come from an electrical engineering background, and upon learning about design, I found myself in kind of this human factors side of industrial design during my time at North Carolina State and Georgia Tech because human factors and ergonomics seem to be concerned with expanding the accessibility of the world around us. When we learned about those fields, it was this is the way that we think about inclusion, inclusivity, accessibility, universal design, all of those kind of those areas that have us thinking about what sometimes are referred to as extreme users, that sit kind of at the margins of who we design for. And so for most of my academic career, I've looked at the ways that older adults and people with disabilities and impairments interact with technology, examining everything from the ways people use it. Technology in their daily lives, experiences with gestures and different interfaces, and even the way design might promote health related behavior change. And so, doing research in this area of evaluating health tools for older adults I found that while our focus was addressing areas of usability that would support the aging population in its entirety, we were oftentimes considering tools that may be out of reach to marginalized older adults or even just marginalized communities, either because of things like, are people familiar with the technology? Do people know how to use the technology beyond just, very basic functioning and operation? And then cultural barriers where different individuals felt that these interventions don't fit their lifestyle or their living environment. And so from this work, as well as looking across the landscape of design research, I found that there is a need to focus on how we might consider marginalized lived experiences in the design of digital tools for the future, specifically in the context of Black and Brown communities, because in many instances, when it comes to thinking about specifically like health technology research and the ways we think about innovation, these communities are typically left behind. And so several scholars have begun to discuss that when we think about technology innovation in a future tense, we think about much of the science fiction of the past and how well that predicted our current reality. Within this discussion, both media and academic scholars show oftentimes the images of things like Star Trek, the Jetsons, and I think, even Back to the Future. Um, as these are the things that we kind of conceptualized back in the 70s and the 80s, and look how they've translated into what we have here today. And I've oftentimes wondered, well, where are the authors and the images that I've seen coming out of, the Afrofuturist text, the Afrofuturist genre, and more blatantly, where are the images of Black and Brown folks in the future and how we see ourselves in the future and the ways that we contribute and think about, the technological world that we're starting to be surrounded by and what that means for our communities in the future. What became really interesting to me in this area is that despite the present genre of Black science fiction writers that have speculated existences for Black and Brown groups in distant futures, including the role that technology plays in these futures, we're still struggling to be truly inclusive in design thinking and developing the future of technology as a human-computer interaction community, as the community of thinkers and creators and kind of digital architects that kind of conceptualize what comes next. Um, you know, Looking at kind of the emphasis on white male authors and creators and television and media programs also erases entire genres of speculative and science fiction that features Black protagonists and written by Black scholars and authors that may very well motivate and challenge our concepts and approaches to technological innovation. So, for example, Octavia Butler's 1993 speculative fiction, Parable of the Sower, depicts the United States in 2024, not too far from where we are right now, experiencing societal downfall laden with economic inequities, climate change, and societal unrest. And as we all kind of know, this is a not so distant future from our current moment and our current reality. Um, Parable of the Sower is among many of the science fiction pieces that employs Afrofuturism and other cultural aesthetics and approaches to science that allow us to interrogate and negotiate the politics of race, class, gender, and ability alongside imagined futures that introduce new societal implications for technology and design. So fast forward to present day, in the neighborhood of East Liberty in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Alicia Wormsley had these words blown up and displayed. There are Black people in the future were put on a billboard to call attention to the Black bodies, families, homes, and history that are often forgotten in gentrification efforts. This text has kind of become the basis of both protest and collective dreaming to reassure the presence of Black people in how we think about the future, and one I strongly believe is finding its way into the tech sector. So why freedom dreams? The title of my presentation is, freedom dreams, and Robin D.G. Kelley's Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, discusses that one of the ways that we envision new ways of living and interacting with each other in our environment is through radical feminist and queer movements that require us to interrogate what is normal or the status quo. It connects us to the concept of the Black radical imagination in a very particular way by envisioning what a radical or even revolutionary future might look like and how we might bring this new world into being. One of the central themes of Kelley's Freedom Dreams is this concept of the Black imagination and how this has maintained over times of triumph and trauma for generations to have dreams of a better future. Kelley actually insists that it is not enough to imagine a world without oppression, but we must also understand the mechanisms of processes that reproduce inequality. And while Kelley uses freedom dreams to discuss the progression of social movements, we can also think about the concept of freedom dreams as activity that has great power within technological movements. And we've begun to see that ideology emerge in the ways that we envision technology for a better world, and technology for social change. Scholars like Ruha Benjamin and Kishana Gray and Andre Brock are all challenging the ways that we think about the interplay of race and technology and how we imagine and reimagine technological futures. Advocating for the inclusion of frameworks and approaches like Afrofuturism, Black feminism, Andre Brock's technoculture, and the Afrofuturist feminism as legitimate critical frameworks centers the lived experiences of Black identities and other historically excluded populations. In a recent essay, I, along with two other Black women technologists and computer scientists, examined the contribution of particularly Black women scholars and designers to the concept and community derived exercise of futuring. And what is futuring? Considering what our reality could be beyond this moment, and doing that in a way that connects, societal implications of, well, what does it mean for us to exist in a way that is more free, that is more liberated? We argue that although the contributions of Black, women scholars and designers were not always formally called futuring, Black artists, scholars, and writers have long engaged in thinking about otherness, and imagined radical futures that differ from temporal existences. There is value in considering the Black imagination in these spaces where we design and consider the future. According to Kelley, considering the Black radical imagination is about how people in transformative social movements move and shift their ideas, rethought inherited categories, and try to locate and overturn blatant, subtle, and invisible modes of domination. So this brings me to this area that I've been exploring, which examines the ways that we engage Black and Brown communities in the design process to speculate futures of technology or even the future of community itself. How do we make this more equitable? How do we shift from traditional participatory methods to being more community-led and community-driven, and considering what this means for the power dynamics that oftentimes exist in the ways that technology shows up, who conceptualizes technology, who is thought to be the creators of technology, versus who is just using technology but most impacted. There's this very interesting interplay that is beginning to resurface between community organizing and design that is producing some really critical conversations about technology. And so I say resurface because we know that there has been long been a history of this. Black and Brown communities working within physical community settings in ways that are more natural to organizing and mutual aid efforts in order to conceptualize both community futures and what it means for different devices and different technologies to be considered a part of that community future. And when I talk about technology, I don't always mean things that are technical. I don't always mean a device or a computer or a laptop. Sometimes when we talk about technology, we just talk about the tools that we use to navigate our everyday world and to change something from one existence to another. We're seeing that now with projects like 51 Futures in the south side of Chicago, where scholar, activist, and designer Chris Rudd has led the charge to reimagine anti racist design with community residents, and the PAC Project, which is a series of community engaged workshops by Stephanie Dinkins that uses art as a vehicle to help community members understand how algorithms, artificial intelligence, and the big data impact their lives and empower them to do something about it. We now know what it could mean to engage the Black community in technological design, and how we move forward to kind of conceptualize those freedom dreams that Kelley was talking about. So for this reason, I feel that design, to be more inclusive, must lean heavily on more community-driven participatory methods for its value of including people that are impacted by design within the practice of design itself. Many scholars in critical areas of design and HCI have begun a larger dialogue about what participation means in design. And so my work is concerned with the more equitable approaches to design participation that not only reduce harm on Black and Brown communities, but also considers how we amplify the imagination and creativity of these communities to foster our own form of freedom dreams through design. So my work further pushes the bounds of how we consider these freedom dreams in design and contributes to this movement by challenging the ways that we think about technology access, and the methods that we use to expand that access. So technology access encompasses so much more than just physical and sensory accessibility. Oftentimes when we think about the term access or accessibility in tech or in the design space, we're thinking about, can I see it? Can I touch it? Can I feel it? Can I hear it? Is it going to be usable in the same ways by everyone? But also we must consider how inclusive product spaces and even design methods are to those with varying values and lived experiences. Who gets to future and how are they doing it? How do we move from technological platforms that happen to us to ones that conceptualize and keep in mind our values, our history, and our legacy of radical movements and world building? So I've worked to address this challenge by exploring participatory methods and co-design methods with historically excluded groups, primarily Black communities. Much of my previous work has looked at how we engage many of these communities in conceptualizing tools to support their overall wellness, health and well-being, socialization, how well can we connect to each other, how well are we advocating for our communities, and as well as how our methods themselves, both in research and design activities, can be more inclusive. So some of the images that I'm showing here on this particular screen are of various community design workshops where I've worked with Black and Brown elders in various communities across Atlanta, across Chicago, and now Pittsburgh, Detroit as well, to think about, what does it mean for us to design a more equitable future for ourselves? What does it mean to advocate for our health and our wellness in ways that looks like, kind of self-guided direction, and kind of advocating for, the tools that we want to see being designed now. More recent work has also explored how we consider the future of various technology platforms that have direct implication in Black and Brown communities. So here we've been interrogating what the technology of the future could look like that actually has meaning to certain communities within the Pittsburgh area. What I'm showing on the screen is where one of the groups in one of the community design workshops has created a physical currency of the future that would be more inclusive to everyone having access to concepts like cryptocurrency and blockchain. And this was actually something that the group, designed and prototyped and mocked up in a physical a physical artifact that would be something similar to, that they could, put in your pocket, go to different stores, different, brick and mortars, but still having access to kind of that bustling movement of cryptocurrency and blockchain that's happening. This area has called me to not only think about who has access to the systems we create, but also who has access to design. So I've begun to consider how we best engage Black communities that have been historically disenfranchised and collaboratively considering equitable futures, whether in the area of health and well being, or the futures of neighborhoods, or even the future of design itself. So, through previous research studies, I've been able to identify some of the benefits of approaching design through a more collectivist approach, and kind of amplifying, kind of that concept of the Black radical imagination among folks who never really consider themselves designers, but, still have that inherent design skill that each of us do, but for what one reason or another, just have not considered ourselves to be able to do that work. Um, and as much as we can identify the value of doing community based design, we must also recognize that there are tensions in participatory and co design, even when it is framed as being, entrenched in the community itself. Sometimes, just in our sheer presence in certain communities, we kind of create power dynamics or overlook histories of trauma that might exist. And the root of these tensions are oftentimes in the values and goals of the design itself. So while the origins of co design are intended to bring about a certain democracy to the design process, more recent engagements of this design approach are laden with a certain level of corporate elitism. And this method has been packaged and monetized as an industry offering, as opposed to something that belongs to the community and belongs to the people on the ground doing the work, living these things every day, that want to advocate for change or want to see change in their communities. Um, a more equitable and inclusive design research culture also calls for us to reconsider what methods are accessible. So we're seeing more conversations about things like information equity and cultural competence. These conversations beg us to consider how design research is being conducted with individuals who have varying experiences with technology itself. And how do we better reach those individuals? How do we consider more inclusive ways to go about design, which doesn't leave those who are already marginalized in society feeling further ostracized or intimidated? So, I want to share a project that I did last year with during the pandemic, but that considered, how do we think about the future of technology? How do we think about the future of community engagement among the youth? And so, in this particular case study, I collaborated with Dr. Tawana Dillahunt at the University of Michigan to conduct a series of speculative co design workshops as an approach to eliciting technology futures and looking at the ways that we can both support the learning of design and digital skills while gaining insight to the visions of tech among young adults. And so we chose to focus on youth here due to the impact of digital access on this population, on this age group, and the importance of considering their technology values in the larger conversation of digital literacy and like what's to come in the future of technology. Um, and so we consider participatory speculative design as it is one of the approaches that really allows communities to think about futures in a collective setting. And among youth, this may be a way to not only consider newer realities, but also to potentially increase tech readiness and awareness, and potentially job preparation. So, the goal of this work was to identify potential design approaches to elicit more inclusive design fictions, particularly in relationship to race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status, with the justification that current approaches in design could lead to historically disenfranchised groups, oftentimes low income minorities, disabled and elderly people, returning citizens, or those living in rural areas to fall behind economically and socially. So we sought to identify, how do voices that are typically neglected and excluded, um, you know, think about the future of technology. We sought to understand approaches to eliciting these more inclusive narratives and ultimately to theoretically shift our design approaches and methods to being more inclusive themselves. So I mentioned before that we use kind of this speculative design approach. And so speculative design is discussed across the field of human computer interaction as an inclusive method to consider technology futures, yet identities such as class, race, or education are oftentimes not included when people think about speculative design as a design approach. However, if we, looking back to what we were discussing earlier, look to frameworks and approaches such as Afrofuturism and building off of work from scholars like Woodrow Winchester and Andre Brock, we actually centered Afrofuturism as a framework in order to motivate, design futures that tend to that lend to more inclusive and impactful concepts of technology and concepts of reality. Afrofuturism is situated to provide a more empathetic design engagement when compared to traditional speculative design approaches. So, Afrofuturism is a growing genre among media and literature. Looking across some of the images that I have on the screen, we've seen it, as I mentioned, a lot of the earliest science fiction that I was introduced to by authors like Octavia Butler, all the way to some of the newer, younger authors such as N.K. Jemisin and Ytasha Womack that are talking about Afrofuturism. We're also seeing it in music. We're seeing it in art. And there's a definite connection between Afrofuturism, not just as a visual aesthetic, but also as a consideration of the interplay between race and technology in the ways that we think about the future of technology. And so this is one of the reasons why we really we built this project up around considering Afrofuturism as a design lens. So we work with a local arts engine called the Arts Incubator, which was established in 2013 by artist Theaster Gates in the Washington Park neighborhood of Chicago. And this particular arts engine serves as kind of a force for neighborhood revitalization and community engagement. There's a lot of different programming that happens at the Arts Incubator, but one of the initiatives that we found, just particularly valuable to the Southside community is the Design Apprenticeship Program, which exposes teenagers and young adults to design through mentorship and skills building in preparation for creative careers in the workforce. So we worked with 6 Black and Hispanic youth that were already enrolled in the Design Apprenticeship Program to engage in an additional weekly class, which would focus on speculative co-design and Afrofuturism, and just talking about different elements of the future. Students were given prompts to consider the future of technology as well as the future of Chicago post-pandemic. And due to the circumstances over the last year or two at this point, these workshops were held remotely, which also allowed us to interrogate remote and virtual approaches to co-design, as this is becoming a method that, even outside of the confines of the pandemic, is being explored as a way to expand access to design. So throughout those weeks, we showed different clips of Black Mirror episodes, the popular Netflix TV show Black Mirror, to kind of probe thoughts about how different, concepts of future technology might show up and the potential societal impacts of and implications of those concepts. We also developed a design workbook as a guide for eliciting speculative design fiction. So to actually have the youth and young adults write out, their thoughts about, well, what is a dystopian reality? What does a utopia for Chicago look like? What does a utopia for my neighborhood look like? How does design play a role in that? Does design play a role in that? So each week we started off introducing the youth to different concepts of design through the design workbook and different types of technology through the Black Mirror clips. And we then walked them through each stage of the design process by engaging them in identifying various dystopian and utopian elements of their current environments, speculating what a utopian future of Chicago would look like, and then visually ideating those ideas through sketches and storyboards. We spent a lot of time really considering the design methods themselves, again, based on literature, which urges us to consider our presence and positionality within design workshop spaces. So, for example, one of the things that quickly came up was how tasking the virtual environment had become for students. And so we brainstormed with the design instructors of the design apprenticeship program to revamp how we engage students during those workshops by taking breaks, having moments where people could turn off their cameras, jump on, jump back off, kind of spreading out the workshops throughout the day. And so from the earlier part of our workshops, a lot of the youth identified that some of the elements that contributed to dystopian realities in the context of their personal lives and environment were things like unfair housing practices, non-livable wages, racism, and bigotry. When identifying what a utopia might look like for them, much of it centered on fairer treatment in society. We found that even in being prompted to envision the future with no bounds, the the design apprenticeship program students could not detach constructs of racism or poverty from their future realities. Technology that would show up would still have to contend with these things because many of these students don't know a world without it. We also found that in using Afrofuturism as a framework, students designed fictions and storyboards focused on addressing how Black and Brown communities could create their own solutions to societal conditions. Youth were able to build onto each other's fictions and center themselves as the technologists, scientists, and governmental leaders, commenting on how Afrofuturism allowed them to see themselves in these design futures. Students said things like, I learned that Afrofuturism basically uses the speculative design method, but it is used to help benefit people of color. It allows me to see myself in it, in the design of the futures that we're coming up with. And another student said it gives Black people a sense of pride. And so we also found that in this work, leveraging Afrofuturism as a design lens, youth were able to pick up on design and technology concepts, which has great implications for when we're thinking about digital literacy, when we're thinking about various learning environments, and the ways that we think about creating tools to support people being engaged in design that might not have thought of themselves as designers. So this work allows us to consider several implications for speculative co-design. Number one, that there's merit in Afrofuturism as a lens for speculating the future of technology. Number two, that there's benefits to having accessible and relatable design fiction probes. And number three, the value of having tools and resources during co-design itself that allowed people to engage flexibly. The design workbook was actually mailed out to the students prior to the workshop starting, and that allowed them to go at their own pace. That allowed them to jot down ideas outside of the window of the workshops themselves and to come back each week having engaged in a way that felt more comfortable for them, and kind of removed those constraints of design has to be done in a particular way. So when we think about where do we go from here, one of the major considerations that really stands out to me is that there are oftentimes these contrasting realities for those who we design with and for. In many instances, utopian futures for Black and Brown youth are the existing realities among the white majority. So when we think about what does it mean for the limit of basic resources and conditions to shape the reality of certain groups, so much that futuring is limited to just basic survival. How do we frame futuring and speculation such that it's inclusive and equitable if there are some groups who are still envisioning livable wages and fair housing practices and anti-racist systems? Where is the space for true radical imagination and innovation? and how can design provide balance there? Robin D.G. Kelley points us to the workings and the thoughts of Antonio Gramsci, who refers to cultural hegemony as the positioning of majority groups in places of control over funding and political support of cultural projects that thereby suggest them as having control over the cultural landscape of said projects. So when we think about this within the context of design, cultural hegemony speaks to technologies and spaces being created by groups that privilege certain identities, thus marginalizing others through the technology itself. Cultural hegemony might explain why certain communities' utopian ideals rest on access to basic resources and addressing systemic oppression, and why futuring seems limited. I also mentioned earlier that one of the things I'm really interested in is how do we push beyond participatory design as just a validation exercise? How do we go from designing for, right now we're in this movement where we're seeing a lot of value in designing with, to actually relinquishing power in design and creating tools using our current position as designers, as technologists, either in industry or in academia, wherever you might find yourself. How do we create tools that we can hand over to communities and to people outside of our institutions to be able to carry on the work of technology innovation without our presence? Because I think that is the moment when we start to see true self advocacy, when we start to see true innovation, when we start to see folks say, here is what we want, without the potential bias or gaze of scholars or researchers in the ways that we currently have set up a research culture and a co-design culture. Lastly, and going back to my earlier point of how Black and Brown communities are considered in our design work, what does it mean to consider just everyday existence of these communities without framing them as problems to be solved? One of the things that kind of came out of this project was, is there room to design for joy or healing or collective community care? One of the things that has emerged from that project to address these areas is the Building Utopia toolkit that supports community ownership of design futures. So we've been exploring a speculative design toolkit which uses an Afrofuturism lens to engage people in collectively thinking about futures, and not necessarily just technology futures or future computing systems, but also the future of spaces that speak to collectivism, the future of design as a social practice, as a community building practice, and what that means for more people to feel like they have access to it. These are things I'm working on through various envisioning tools that support folks being able to pick up a resource or a tool and actually start to do futuring on their own. And so we've built this toolkit. It's now currently available. And we're starting to see the ways that people are using this to reimagine, their community values, their organizational values, education curriculum, and just how pervasive the concept of futuring is in our everyday lives. And lastly, rethinking the ways that we provide access to design and how co-design can actually, like cultivate thinking about design futures, also looks like creating tools and resources for those who are interested in learning more about what design is. And so my lab has actually created a zine that is intended to support people interested in learning about and engaging in community-driven participatory design. So I would like to acknowledge some of the funding agencies and research and community partners that have made this work possible, and say, a very huge thank you for all of the collaboration that has happened thus far, and leave you all on a quote with, that states, what's great about collective participation in design is it allows people to speculate about their future while confronting their politics. Thank you all so much. and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you for that great talk. Yeah, if you have questions, pop them in. Thank you to those of you who've already put some in. You've had a little while to think about it. Are there any other science fiction novelists you would push us toward reading, Christina?
Yeah, I added some. I'm not sure if it shows the response as public.
Yeah, I saw it. You've got N.K. Jemison's How Long
Yeah.
Until Black Futures Month and The City We Became, and then Black from the Future. Are there any others come to mind?
I definitely think Octavia Butler is a prominent place to start. And then I think that there are a lot of newer authors that I would recommend, both on the academic and just on the non kind of academic literature side. But Patrice Gaskins and her techno vernacular are interacting with Afrofuturism in a very particular way. So is Andre Brock's work. Jana Brown's Black Utopias is a fairly good read. As I mentioned in the talk, Yatasha Womack has a couple of books on Afrofuturism, and I believe is coming out with another series very soon. And I'm trying to think, like looking at my bookcase mentally in my mind. But yeah, I think that those are a lot of good ones, a lot of good places to start. Or some of my favorite authors.
That's awesome. Thank you. Let's just take these in order. A lot of nice questions here. Jamel Watson Daniels says, I am a Black American scholar who has found it to be complicated to engage this kind of work in majority white spaces. What do you see as the role of personal identity in working on these projects? As in, if someone is a non-Black person interested in engaging with Black scholars on these issues, what types of things should they be doing or keeping in mind when approaching this work? Have you seen instances of co-design blur into co-opting, and how do you handle or avoid this? Nice question. Thank you, Jamel.
Yeah, I definitely, thank you for that question, Jamel. I've definitely seen instances of co-design become co-opting, and I think one of the strongest things, at least when people approach me interested in doing this kind of work with these communities, is I always ask them, what is the motivation behind going into certain communities and working with certain communities, and who's leading it. I always push for co-facilitation when working with community groups, as in letting someone from that community group actually facilitate the work, as opposed to just the scholars from the university or the researchers from whatever institution. Because I think when we lead with co-facilitation, or even kind of taking a backseat and letting community groups, facilitate for themselves, and kind of learning from the ways, because they know their community organization or their community group or their neighborhood or their educational group, whatever it is, they know that much better than we do, as academics or industry researchers coming in, at a very particular point that tends to be like far later than the work has started. And so co-facilitation is one of the big ones. But I think I've also experienced a lot of people that will approach, a lot of non-Black or brown people who will approach and ask questions about how to lead this work in more ethical and equitable ways. And I think that we're starting to see groups of folks who want to do this work right, and who want to do this work by kind of pushing and amplifying the voices that have been neglected in design and design research for so long. And I hope to see that expand more, such that it does not become, kind of that, equity tourism that's been happening in other sectors. I think that could easily begin to happen in design and technology. And I think we're seeing that sometimes with like who gets funded, what projects happen, who companies want to listen to. So I definitely think it's something to address. I don't know that I have the spot on answer, but yeah, hopefully that addressed some of that question.
Yeah, that's a really great Great point about equity tourism. Catherine Neal asks if you could say more about the histories of research culture and how that limits participation.
Yeah, I actually think that goes hand in hand with Jamel's question. I think particularly research like universities and academic institutions have histories of harm to Black and Brown communities. Many academic universities actually sit in neighborhoods, cities of Black and Brown folks, and oftentimes use them as research subjects, similar to like lab rats, and then abandon once a project is over, disappear. People never know what happens with their data. People never know, what comes out of the project. They don't see the papers. They don't see the presentations. And, over the history of the university or a research department, it has caused a big tension between the community itself and the university or the institution, because I believe that there are some tech companies who might, be just as responsible for these types of behaviors and research culture. And that, of course, stifles participation. I've now seen groups that will say, no, you cannot come in and talk about research. We don't want researchers in here. We don't, we want our residents or, people that patronize a particular community center or whatever the case may be to feel safe and to feel like they're not being observed or studied. And I think that there's a huge reckoning that has to happen between how we do research, why we do research. I've been exploring a lot, how participatory design and participatory research, community-based participatory research methods can work to mitigate that. But I think that there's even within that, there's still the tension and the power dynamic of, me coming in, even as a Black researcher, but still coming in from institutions that the history far precedes me. And I think that it's just something that we have to think about. And I think when we go down to Elizabeth's question of compensation when engaging in CPPR, considering the time commitment and investment, that's also a part of it. How are we paying people? Are you paying people like they have the lived expertise and the lived experience that you are wanting to learn from? Or are you paying them, $20 for what can be a very emotionally tasking work sometimes to talk about, because oftentimes these projects center around trauma, or oftentimes these projects center around what's wrong. And one of the things that we've explored in this project that I shared today with the design apprenticeship program was just that, hiring these students as apprentices to learn about design, to engage in design, while also getting credit for the program that they were in. So paying them, an hourly rate that looked like the job that they were already, signed up for the summer, such that it becomes a little bit more equitable when you think about this term of like mutual gain of what do folks get out of participating in your research project, because it can't always just be we get data, we get, these insights, these themes, these patterns, these papers, these books, these journal articles. What do community residents get is oftentimes what's left unanswered.
Thank you. You're getting ahead of me, answering all the questions I haven't even asked yet. Remember, you got time to pop some in, although I got some of my own. Woodrow so appreciates the starting quote, "What is normal? And how do we now begin to stop thinking about these notions and considerations as something else disparate from normal design rather than simply how we should design, full stop?" And actually, I had thoughts on that before going to the end, but it's something I was kind of wondering about as I listened to you talk too, is like, where does this stop in the best way, right? Is there any community for whom these aren't the right methods? That I would love to hear your thoughts about that. And then Woodrow goes on to say that the speaker series shouldn't be just a special series. The brilliant talks should have just been part of the overall research webinars so that these topics are seen as core and integral to what and how we do. And so I guess I agree and I disagree with that latter part. I'm sort of excited at spotlighting something that cuts across a whole lot of different areas, but I would like to hear your thoughts on I guess in general, Woodrow is sort of asking about framing this as difference versus integrating it into everything until it becomes the norm. And Woodrow, if I've misinterpreted, please let me know.
Hi, Woodrow. I think Woodrow's like 100% correct. You know, this concept of otherness, this concept of like, you know, the needs and desires, especially in terms of technology, of Black and Brown communities being otherized. You know, there's two sides when you think about, okay, how are we thinking about the other? How are we thinking about alternative futures, alternative existences, and alternative realities for ourselves? But what ends up happening, I think, again, thinking about the whole concept of research culture, is that when people go into certain communities and want to do research and help, they often come away with, well, this community or group lives like this and it's so different from the norm that we have to pay attention to it. When in reality, there, you know, if you surveyed 12 white communities, you know, you might have 12 different needs or realities or lived experiences in terms of how we think about design, how we think about technology, how we think about the environments around us. Yet I think that there is oftentimes an overemphasis when we look at, you know, how Black and Brown communities do certain things, the research that we focus on, the ways that we, you know, the things that we put out into the world. I think, you know, thinking about things like this lecture series, and I've had this discussion, and we actually, you know, published something about this in Interaction, is that, you know, how do we move from people wanting to talk to us as Black computer scientists to just computer scientists who do work, because not everyone even focuses on Black communities in their work. And that's oftentimes, I think, you know, a mind-blown thing for non-Black scholars when they invite us to these equity panels and these workshops, and it's like, my work happens to, but there are other folks who are like, my work doesn't even focus on that. And so I think it's you know, that otherization of the work that is done. You know, Afrofuturism and integrating Afrofuturism in design is not meant to separate, you know, Black communities, Black folks, Black scholars from the mainstream of design, but more so to make us even more visible with more culturally tailored emphasis on, you know, the ways that we see the world. And I think if we can start to think of it, you know, if we can start to integrate these things more into classrooms, if we can start to bring this more into design education, technology education, CS education, if we can start to integrate these things more into the ways that companies are thinking, right? And not just during a particular month or a particular week or a particular series, but saying we have a line of products, we have a, you know, this is part of our framework, our design framework, our research framework of how we think about things. Because, you know, that, and I can't think of who said that quote, the quote at the moment, but this concept of when we center the most marginalized, you encompass designing for everyone. When you center, you know, the folks who have been racially minoritized, who sit at or below the poverty line, who are living with disabilities and impairments, you can't help but to design for everyone that is not that. So as this becomes more of the mainstream and less of the extreme, I think we'll start to see less of a need for the otherization.
Thank you for that. That hits on something that I had wanted to ask, which is that you started off by talking about the breadth of your work, which includes work with older people and work with people with different abilities. And I'm wondering how you see these different kinds of marginalization. Does working with the different kinds of marginalized communities inform work with others? Is it all part and parcel of the same? Are they all kind of their own family of concerns? How do you think about the connections among and between?
I mean, I think it all starts to merge to a point, right? Because I think collective liberation is intergenerational, right? We have to learn from the past. We have to understand how the youth are envisioning the future in order to really understand what direction things should go. And so a lot of my former work or my previous work and still ongoing work, because I still do a lot of work with Black elders, is understanding, you know, the technology needs, the perspectives, the opinions, and stemming from, again, who has been left out of those conversations, but just as equally, we don't necessarily see Black youth as being, we don't necessarily think of them as much as being the digital creators and the architects that they are. So how do we amplify both at the same time? Because that's, you know, when we understand, you know, a lot of the work I do with Black elders, I get a lot of stories, I get a lot of history, right? And that's so beautiful to me. And then a lot of the work with the youth, you get a lot of what could be, right? So we know what was and what could be, we can see the direction of what kind of where we need to go. And that's kind of the emphasis of the Building Utopia toolkit that we have. And again, like one of the reasons why we stem in Afrofuturism, because it allows us to think about the past, the present, and the future in the ways that we think about design and technology.
We have a few questions and we're running out of time here. I'm going to give Danae the floor because Danae brought you in. Thank you, Danae. Danae says, hi, Christina, great talk. Something you mentioned a bit earlier was designing for joy, and a concept I love. Can you talk more about how the Utopia design cards toolkit you discussed can help Black and brown people reflect on their joy as they speculate new solutions and systems? I think this is a great way to think of how we can empower marginalized communities in a way that aligns with their goals.
Yeah, so one of the things when we started developing the toolkit, you know, the first pass was like identifying, here are all of the challenges that marginalized communities oftentimes might be faced with or want to deal with: gentrification, food deserts, you know, mental health access, doctors not listening to us. But then, you know, we worked with Black Women Flourish, who is a collective of Black women and non-binary folks based out of Baltimore, Maryland, that kind of, you know, helped us with this liberatory design practice to think about, well, you know, our communities are not all struggle and challenge. And so when we're thinking about building design tools, you know, make sure that that's evident there as well, right? We know it, but how do we make sure that that's evident in design as well? And so one of the things that we did was we balanced out a lot of the prompts and the cards in the toolkit with things like designing for joy. Does that, like, how do we connect to our ancestors? What are we leaving behind as, you know, for our future descendants? How do we think about the futures that we're creating? How do we identify our community values? And all of those contribute to design just as much as, you know, the challenges that we face. I think it speaks to a larger emphasis in design. Oftentimes when we're thinking about Black and brown communities, design is centered around solving a problem, addressing a problem, identifying a problem. But our communities are not that, right? Our communities thrive, we dance, we laugh, we joke, we create. And so I think that one of the things we really wanted to make sure in the toolkit was that we captured that and allowed people to kind of, you know, ideate and think and brainstorm in future about that. Whether you're, you know, working with a company, you're working with an organizational group, you're working with, or just spending time with your family and friends and wanting to have prompts to kind of, you know, spark conversation. And so, yeah, thinking about the joy that Black and brown communities experience and how we design for that, right? How do we create things, whether they be murals or art installations or, you know, documentation processes, or technology, right? How do we create technology that centers Black and brown joy? I think is kind of going to be the next wave of what we need to focus on, both on the industry and the academic tech sector.
Yeah, I love that so much. That's kind of my own dream is how do we design for joy? So, and of course, it's key to Microsoft's mission as well. I wish we could keep talking because I have so many more questions, and there have been some other ones that have come out here, but we are at time. So let me just encourage everybody to please tune in a few weeks for the very last of this wonderful series. And after this, we are not going to stop talking about these issues. We're just going to integrate them across all the things that we talk about. And we're going to have Black and brown people talking about areas of expertise that have nothing to do with race. Don't you worry. Thank you so much, Christina. Nikki Washington is going to be talking in 2 or 3 weeks. I'm sorry, I don't have the date off the top of my head, but she'll be talking about computer science education. And that's going to be super fun. Thank you, Christina. This has been really great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.